welcome to tonight's episode of Beginner Breakdown. My name is Alex Moellering, and the topic I have for you tonight is how to learn a chess opening. So in the past, I've talked about, kind of how to make an opening selection, thinking of different openings and what might fit you the best, and that we based it off considerations of style and whether it's like a setup-based opening or a sequence-based opening. Feel free to check out that video. Tonight, we're not going to be talking specifically about, finding the best opening for you, but it's more about when you found your opening, whatever you want to learn, how to actually go about learning it. And there's a few different things you want to keep in mind. We're going to be talking about one, there is still some factor of, your selection and understanding like what your approach is, because certain openings might allow for different game plans. Certain openings might have different skill levels as well. But the main thing we're going to be thinking about are the goals, the plans, the principles, the style of the opening, as well as what resources you can use to improve. So whether that's using just the internet and a web browser, books, Lichess or chess.com, coaches, videos, etc. So without further ado, let's kind of jump into it. And I'm going to give you the premise for this video, which was something that I do a lot is I play a lot of bullet chess. Bullet is 1 minute, very fast. There's some other variants of the time control, but I play usually 1 minute, very fast, and that's just because I am maybe a little psychotic in that way. And it's just a quick time thing. I don't mind if I lose a bullet game. And most of the time, when you're playing the black pieces in bullet, like 9 out of 10 times, your opponent plays e4. Happens so often. And against e4, I have a kind of special bullet repertoire that I play. I don't play it normally because it's not very good, but it's kind of tricky. So I play some Sicilian stuff, and my ideas are I like to get my queen and bishop out on this diagonal and put pressure on f2, and it's very suspicious and not good at all, but very fun to play. The problem comes is that in bullet you don't have a lot of time, and so I'm pre-moving a bunch, and often on the first move, sometimes I'll just get impatient and I'll pre-move c5, and sometimes my opponent will play d4. And now c5 is a little bit strange. We're no longer playing a Sicilian. This is something totally different. So from this position, I'm in whole new territory. This isn't something I'd studied. It's just, okay, well, I guess I'm here. I'm just playing a game of chess. But there's a lot to think about, right? Sometimes people push past my pawn. Sometimes they take. Sometimes they defend with a move like knight to f3 or c3 or e3 or something and defend their pawn. There's a whole bunch of different things that can happen here. But regardless of what my opponent chooses to play, I am totally out of theory. It's a funny message. Okay, so there's a few options I have here. One is I could be a little more patient. I could sit on my hands, right, and try and make the best move. I could watch for my opponent and be aware of the threats they're making and do all of that thinking and solid playing. Or the other option is to be real stubborn and stick with this move and decide I'm going to base a whole YouTube video off learning a new opening. And that's what we're going to do. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend my reasoning, but I do think we're going to find something useful. Because in thinking, okay, well, I want to learn more about this, I came to some really interesting insights that I wanted to share with you all. So the first thing is I took a look at my own kind of records in the database. I just used openingtree.com to give me insight into my own chess playing data and found that, yeah, whenever my opponent plays d4, I've played c5 way more often than I have played my normal move, which would be knight to f6. I've played c5 about like 540 times, and I've played knight to f6 about 420 times. So I'm doing this one way more. And so, yeah, let's just kind of jump into it. First question is, what is this opening? Is it even an opening? And to answer that question, right, sometimes you might be like, oh, I've heard about some opening, like the Spanish defense, or the Alekhine defense, or the Scotch game. You'll hear something, be like, that sounds interesting, or maybe I know someone who plays that. I want to try and learn that. In this case, it's kind of the opposite. I have some moves on a board, and I don't know what it's called, so how am I going to find out? Well, what I did is I just went into Lichess. There was a really useful tool. I just went to the analysis board and plugged in these moves, and it told me right away after I played d4, c5, it said I'm playing the Old Benoni defense, and it had a whole quote. It said the Old Benoni defense is quite rare and uncommon nowadays, but can actually lead to a tactical and sharp game. Black takes a swipe with c5 and gambits a pawn for the exchange, develops, get pieces into the game. White normally responds with d5, taking pawns, and it kind of goes into this whole long quote. I'm not going to read the whole thing. You can feel free to pull up a Lichess browser and see what it says. But that is already giving me a lot of information. I have a name, Old Benoni defense. I can now use that to look it up and get some more information. And it has the information it just gave me. So let's actually break down kind of what was in that quote and how I can use that to try and learn this as a new opening. Okay, first of all, I want to understand the real basics, and for those who aren't aware of like any opening principles. So the 3 opening principles, as always, you want to control the center of the board. Controlling this space is very helpful. It's going to be a great launching pad for your army wherever you need to target, right? If you're trying to target your opponent's king, if they stay in the center, you want your pieces to stay in the center. If they switch to the king side, you want to be able to switch your pieces quickly to the king side, and vice versa for the queen side, right? And moving your pieces from the center to that direction is easier than moving it from one side of the board to the other. So we want to control the center of the board. We want to develop our pieces, right? If they're just sitting on the back row not doing anything, that's not super helpful. And finally, we want to worry about king safety. How is our king safe? How are we making our opponent's king unsafe? So we're keeping those questions in mind with everything we do. Now, e4 is a much sharper, more tactical game most of the time, right? The bishop and the queen are coming out. Sometimes there's threats against f7, and we've seen all of this stuff before. d4 is a more strategic, positional game, right? It's more about denying your opponent, right? So d4 is stopping stopping black from doing a few things. I can't play e5 anymore because I'm just going to get taken. I mean, I can. It's a gambit. I think it's called the England gambit. Not objectively very good, but kind of tricky. But yeah, I don't just want to give up a pawn here. And knight to c6, another move I like to play in a lot of variations, is maybe not so good here either, because maybe the pawn can just push forward and provoke my knight. So this move is more about denying black opportunities than making stuff for white, right? White can get this bishop out, but that's really the only thing they've helped with development with d4. So what's the point with c5? Well, the first part of that quote from Lichess was black takes a swipe with c5 and gambits a pawn for the exchange. So a gambit is just any time we're giving up material for some kind of compensation, some other benefit. In this case, the idea is we're gambiting it for what? Gambits a pawn for the exchange, develops, and gets a piece into the game. Get pieces into the game. So I'm trying to get my pieces into the game, be very active, and try and control a lot of space and make threats in exchange for giving up this pawn. White normally responds with d5. And this is interesting to me, right? The first time I look at this, I see, well, wait a minute, there's a very natural move, which is just for the pawn to recapture. So in my mind, I need to think about this. But then if I go back to that Lichess quote, it actually tells me something about it. It says taking the pawn is not recommended because of e6. And now we see there is a discovered attack. This bishop has opened up and is attacking c5. And it continues. And if white tries defending this pawn, right, something like b4, then black can continue a5. And white has no solutions to keep holding on to these pawns. And you might not see that at first. You're like, well, wait a minute. They have other pawns. They can defend. Well, the problem is we just have too much pressure. Our bishop is kind of x-raying through this pawn. If you try something like a3, this isn't very good because notice the rooks are now kind of lined up. If I take, you can't actually take back or you're going to lose your rook. So you can't play a3. c3 looks like a more reasonable try. Right now, if I take and you take back, then I still can't take with my bishop. So what might be the point here? Well, I can take, and if you take back, I can just continue development with a really nice attack with something like queen to f6. And notice your rook is not defended by anything. It's kind of stuck in the corner, and it's actually, I think, impossible to save. You can sacrifice something else. There's a give up, well, the knight's maybe not good. Yeah, it's actually very hard to save this piece. And you can try and explore that on your own, what you might try. But this is not a very good way to play for white. And so this is, I'm already learning, okay, so there's some traps here in this opening, right? This is a kind of tricky line. And if, if white just plays normal moves here, I don't know, something like knight c3, then I feel very good in this position. I've developed my bishop, my pawns are kind of really nicely guarding these light squares. I can try and play for a kingside castle. I can push for d5. I have some options. My only concern in this type of position might be that my bishop is not very developed. It's going to be hard to get it out this way, so I'm probably going to need to get it out this way. But as long as I keep that in mind and think about how I'm going to develop that piece, this feels pretty comfortable to try and play. So, okay, I'm not really worried about that capture anymore. And again, that's all because of what Lichess told me. But d5 is the main move. The other thing I want to look at is, right, what if they defend, right? Well, it's already defended by the queen, so they could just ignore it and play some move. But then you run into some problems, almost like a reverse Scandinavian, where if the queen comes out, I can just kind of attack it and get some free development. It's going to have to waste time. It came out. It's going to have to waste time running away. And I've gotten just free moves with my pieces. I actually don't mind that the c pawn is gone because my queen can maybe come out somewhere on this diagonal later and cause some trouble. So this feels fine to play as well. I wouldn't be worried about memorizing the theory from here. And if you just defend it with something else, whatever else, a knight, a pawn, then I'm probably still just going to take, and I've gotten rid of a center pawn for white for one of my side pawns. White has a little bit more center control, but white also got the first move, so I can't be too upset about that. And so these are just my initial thoughts, right? I know nothing about this opening other than what I've been kind of breaking down with you. And I had heard the name Benoni defense. I knew the real basics, but this was all stuff I was investigating today. And the point isn't for you to take an understanding about the Benoni defense. You're free to, but I'm not an expert in that. What I'm trying to share with you is how I went about learning this opening, what I did to try and find it. So I just kind of experimented around and played around with some different moves. I used the engine to see what it was recommending, as well as what Lichess was automatically telling me from that quote. Okay, so d5 is the main move, the most popular move, and it's the one I need to work on. The other thing that I noticed immediately, without getting too far off track, is remember something that Lichess said about this opening. It said, this opening is quite rare nowadays. One idea is for black to transpose to a modern Benoni. Okay, well, and then you think, well, this was called the Old Benoni defense, so I guess maybe there is a more modernized version. And so I just Googled modern Benoni and Old Benoni and found that the modern Benoni defense, I just found this from a Wikipedia page, is a chess opening that begins with the moves 1 d4, 2 knight f6, white plays 2 c4, c5. So we've started with the knight and then pushed the pawn, and then usually white continues with d5 and black with e6. And this is kind of the modern Benoni position. And so, okay, well, we can transpose to this from the Old Benoni. So if I play c5, and if white continues with d5, I attack with my knight. And if you play c4 to defend, well, now we're just in that exact same position. So I've learned, okay, so there's an old version and a new version, and the one I've been playing is the old version. Is there any reason why it's old? For this, it's sometimes harder to find some of those more noodly questions. I had the luxury of working here at the chess club, and so I just asked some of my coworkers who are more experienced in this opening, why one is the old one, what's not so modernized about it. You might also be able to find this from some online videos or books, but the main reason, as far as I understand it, is that the problem is after c5, d5, if I continue with knight to f6, then white does not have to play pawn to c4. They can play something like knight to c3 instead, defending. And now white can shoot for just more general control of the center with something like pawn to e4, and maybe this knight eventually kind of travels over to c4 where that pawn was. And this is maybe a little harder for me to deal with, just the space advantage that my opponent has. So this is kind of a more high-level reason why the old version has been more modernized. Is that relevant for me? Well, maybe, but I actually am not so convinced it is. I think it's good to know about, but that shouldn't be a deterrent for me playing the old version for a few reasons. One, I'm not looking to play a lot of grandmasters with this opening and not in fast time controls or in slow time controls. This is more of a trick weapon and something I just want to try and learn and understand and see how it works. And so I'm not worried about my opponents knowing like the perfect modern theory to punish my opening. So that's kind of my first thought. Okay, the other thing to know is, yeah, this opening, the modern one, so not just the old version, but starting with knight to f6, this is a much more theoretical opening, which just means that it's been studied a lot more by grandmasters, by chess engines, and so there's a lot more data on what moves are more accurate and less accurate, and more people who are going to be memorizing book moves about it than with c5. So that's actually, for me, a reason I maybe want to stick with the older one, because not many people are going to be as familiar with it, and it's going to be a better surprise weapon. So I've been mentioning kind of these databases that I've been using to, like engines and different things, and there's some really interesting information you can learn. So on Lichess, for example, you could also use ChessBase, or there's plenty of different ways to get access to a chess database. But Lichess is just free and it's online. And I went to it, and there's a few different settings. You can just go to the Masters database, which imports a whole bunch of master games, high-level games. And you can go to the Lichess database. And the Lichess database just takes everybody who's played on their servers and takes those games and just automatically uploads them to the database, I believe. And so there was a few different things of information I got. The first was I went to the Masters database, and I noticed that d4, c5, d5. In the Masters database, this is what happens anytime somebody plays c5. 76% of games in the Masters database in this position, white wins. Okay, so white's winning 75% of the time, black winning about 25% of the time, and very few draws. So that tells me a lot. One, this is just probably better for white, right? If masters are winning 3/4 of the time here with white, that's better. But also, it's a very imbalanced game, right? Not a lot of draws, so you're gonna have some sharp, exciting stuff. So that's good to know about the opening. And I also saw that these were the moves played the vast majority of the time. Everything other than d5 was played less than 10% of the time. So really, d5 is the main thing I need to learn if I want to theoretically know how to beat this opening. I still want to learn the other ones, and so my approach to that is, well, if I know what's the main line, I also want to think about what are the popular things that are getting played. And to do that, I just put some filters on the Lichess database. I went to the Lichess database, I clicked it, I put, and if you can't see, that's okay, I'll describe it, but, oh, cool. So you can see down here, these are all the different moves, and it says the percentages, and it's got the Old Benoni defense written here, so that's really useful. And I went into this kind of filter, and this is the one it's set to now. I'm not gonna mess with this because this is just the St. Louis Chess Club's one, but I set it to all the faster time controls, basically anything that was faster than classical or correspondence. So rapid, blitz, bullet, ultra bullet. And then for the rating, I put it from 400 up to 1800, and I took off 2000, 2200, 2500. And my reasoning was, well, that's about my skill level. I am a 1500 USCF player, on a good day, and I'm mostly playing these faster times. So those are the moves that I want to look at. What are people playing at my skill level, at my time control? And when I put those filters on, the data I got was that one, it's about a 50-50 split between white and black winning. So the people at my level aren't versed enough in this opening theory to know how white is supposed to get their advantage, at least not as much as the masters are. And two, while d5 is still the most popular number 2 move, it was only played about 23% of the time. Compare that with the 76% of the time it was played by the masters. The other moves, d takes c5 was played about as much, it was about 20%, c4 about 16%, and then a bunch of moves defending the pawn, e3, c3, knight f3, were played in total about 30% between all of those 3 moves. Which told me that, okay, I'm going to be faced with a whole bunch. So if I want to look at this opening, I should probably know the most critical mainline stuff, but I don't need to spend all my energy there. I can spend a good amount of time, and I should, understanding what to do if they play a whole bunch of different stuff. Okay, so this is still kind of my preparation. I haven't actually learned really any of the plans in this opening yet. I'm still just finding some information about it to get comfortable with how to then learn more about it. The other things I want to mention, some just really quick, other books and online resources. I found a few. There's Wikibooks. I found some information about this opening, the Old Benoni. The problem was it gave me more generalized stuff, lots of the variations and the really, really mainline and traditional ideas, but it didn't give like detailed breakdowns and how to punish mistakes. So if you want to get comfortable with information, a book, something like that, can usually give you some more generalized approach. But more specific books, so I found in our library, for example, there was one called The Complete Benoni by Lev Sakis. It was written in 1995, which is a little old for an opening book because engines have really improved the lines a lot. But to just familiarize myself with opening plans, that felt like a good one to look for. And then also there were some online videos, some that the Chess Club has put out by Jonathan Schranz did a few called Modern Benoni is No Baloney. Those are pretty fun if you want to learn about this opening particularly. Yasser Sarawan, our spokesperson, put out a video called A Roadmap Within the Modern Benoni. Those are, again, the modern, not the old one. But just YouTube, looking up different videos. You can look up from us or from other channels. There's plenty of great ones out there. Had good information. So those are some other resources you can use. And now I want to talk about a little more specifics of this opening. So the first place I went to some of those videos. There was one by National Master Jim McLaughlin here at the Chess Club. And he talked about this idea, that c5, the problem, he says, with the Old Benoni here is that it's conceding a space advantage. And this is what helped me understand, well, why is d5 played so much? Why is it so good? And he said, well, it's giving white a pawn that's way strong in my territory, right? Normally, that doesn't happen in something like d4, d5, right? A more classical game. I'm holding off white's advance. Or even, something like the Nimzo, right? Anything that's stopping white from just immediately pressing forward is important. And so the downside there is I have given white some more space, and especially once they've played c4 and try and really locked in that space, I'm going to be a little more cramped, right? Notice right away, it's harder for me to develop some of my pieces. This knight, it's not so easy to get into the game this way. One of the bishops is going to be kind of stuck, right? e6 or d6. I'm going to play one of those moves to fight against this pawn, and the bishop that's stuck behind is going to have a little bit of trouble, right? If I play e6, for example, this bishop has a little bit of trouble, and vice versa. So I have some space and development problems I need to kind of face here. In compensation, he argues is, well, one thing you can do is lock up the position. So he showed an example of d6, and if white plays something like c4, you can continue with e5. And notice here, this position is very blockaded. So the nice thing is it's not easy to get checkmated very quickly here, right? There's not many open lines for the bishops, the rooks, the queens, the heavy pieces to infiltrate the position. It's going to be a more slow maneuvering game. And if that's your style, maybe that'll help you. That's not exactly how I wanted to play the system. So I thought, okay, well, that gave me some information, but let's see what else I can find. And so I went back to that book, The Complete Benoni by Lev Sakis, and went and found something interesting. So his stuff was all recommending the modern Benoni, but remember, some of those transpositions can happen, right? So this is the old one. And we can transpose to the modern in this move order. Again, white has to choose to play c4. They don't have to. But if they do, then all of the theory he was writing about still applies. And from this position, I did something that I'm going to recommend to people is if you have an access to a book or something, often there will be an index of variations, either in the front with like the table of contents or somewhere in the back. And this was in the back of his book. And what I did is I went to those Lichess database numbers and I followed what are the most popular moves that my opponents are playing at my level, at the speed of game I'm playing, and what moves would this book recommend against them. And so I looked, and this is what I found. So in this position, the most popular move that white would play against someone of my skill level and at the speed I'm playing is knight to c3, which is, I think, the main line. And his recommendation was e takes d5. C takes d5 was the most popular, d6, e4, g6, and I thought, okay, well, so maybe this is now telling me this is kind of a fianchetto style opening, where I want to fianchetto my bishop, and I can already start to see maybe why that is, right? I have my pawns occupying these dark squares, initially the one on c5, controlling these dark squares. And so now getting my bishop, right, it's not going to come out this way, probably. So getting it, you know, to g6, and then kind of eyeing this long diagonal looks like a very powerful tool, right? It's really helping me cement my control of the center. So I was like, okay, well, that makes sense. Knight to f3, most popular move from my settings, bishop to g7. Something else I was noticing as I was going here is I was tracking, is the most popular move the same as the most critical move, the one that the masters are playing in their database? And so far they have been. This is where that diverges. The main moves by far in the Lichess database are bishop e2, bishop d3, h3, bishop g5. In the Masters database, bishop e2 and h6 are the winners by far. And the most popular move in the Lichess database was bishop to d3. And so I was in this index and I thought, okay, so I need to look at some of those other moves and figure out why. I can start to maybe intuit why some of them are good, right? Bishop g5 pinning the knight. h3 probably preventing bishop to g4. You know, maybe they don't want to let me get this pin. Bishop e2, I didn't really understand. Why is this the main move? Why is this more popular than bishop d3? This looks more natural. Maybe I'm controlling this diagonal. So I explored. I thought, okay, well, if bishop d3 is played, then castles is the move recommended. Bishop g4 is another line. But there was a few lines that were kind of offered here. And this maybe shows the age of the book a little bit. The computer kind of actually liked some of the things that he wasn't so sure about. And again, that's because, what, 20, 30 years have passed since he wrote it, and technology has advanced quite a bit. But something like this might happen, or say bishop g4. The reason he didn't like this move was only, it wasn't because of h3 or anything else, it was only because of queen to a4. If I block, then knight to d2. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. The whole point of this check was just so I don't trade with the knight. The knight runs away and it's going to go maybe here, or I'm not sure. So that was kind of interesting. And then I went to the bishop e2 lines and saw, well, wait a minute. If this is played after bishop g4, white does the same thing. So now I've learned, okay, white really wants to keep this knight on the board. They don't mind trading the bishops or anything, but they don't want to let this knight get taken off. And I still have to figure out some of why that is. I think looking at it right now, this square looks kind of nice to attack this backwards d6 pawn. And maybe also, once the bishops are traded, maybe the knight even can go back to like f3 and help fight for this e5 square, right? A few different kind of ideas potentially. Again, I'm not an expert in this. Don't trust me on Benoni knowledge, but in learning how do I gain information about a new opening and learn it for myself, I think this is kind of helpful. Okay. The next thing I did was I looked at some master games. And some of these came from books, some of these came from YouTube, just looking up Old Benoni defense master games. And there were a few interesting ones that came up. The first one I want to show here is a game that was played between someone named Salamanca, and with the black pieces was Bobby Fischer. And in thinking, oh, that's cool, Bobby Fischer played this opening, I found out that, well, he and another player who I really like, Mikhail Tal, both played this opening, which is telling me this can really be played for some very sharp, exciting chess, which is something I kind of like to hear. That's something I'm interested in. d4. Now in the game, it was the modern way, right? Knight to f6, c5, and e6. If we had played the Old Benoni, c5 immediately, assuming white still kind of gives us some move order to get here, we're going to transpose into the same thing. But either way, the position reaches this. And we're not going to go through the whole game, just kind of the intro to something that I found really helpful. And this I actually want to shout out Agadmater's chess channel, because the video that I found this from was called When Fischer Plays the Benoni, You Run. It's a really good video. I recommend you check it out. And there's something he said very early on in like the first 2 or 3 minutes, and that's really the only thing I'm going to talk about to let people go over to him too, was he kind of played through the first couple moves of this game. So knight to c3, pawn takes, g6, d6. So this is similar. We saw all this in those mainline stuff. And we can talk about some of the specifics if we have time, but I want to focus on more just general opening theory and learning them. Bishop d7, f4. And so another really critical idea that comes in a lot of this is this pawn loves to push because white would love to continue taking space at some point in the center with e5. And so what Agadmatur talked about that I thought was really helpful here was in the game, white played knight to f3, but he stopped and he said, but I used to play the Benoni a lot as black. Again, this is Agadmatur talking. I used to play the Benoni a lot as black, and I was really afraid of my opponent playing e5. And then he immediately broke down why this wasn't a good idea. And this is, I think, so helpful for if you're looking to learn a new opening, is to find really good YouTube channels that talk about the opening, and not just here's what you should do, but also, well, here's what doesn't work, whether it's for your side or your opponent's, because the best way to get that is from experience, and that's what they're sharing. And so it looks like e5 right away is really scary, right? We can imagine takes, takes, and now like our knight has to move, but look at these pawns, like that is so scary. And he said, this is not something to worry about at all, and here's why, right? He said, the problem is, after our knight moves, the bishop and knight double attack this e5 pawn, and there's not a good way to keep it safe. White is actually gonna lose one of these pawns, and maybe even both of them because they're overextended. He gave this example. Well, what if you play e6, right? Getting out of the line of fire and putting pressure. Well, okay, let's take, recaptures, and now queen h4. And we can see that we are punishing white for being a little too aggressive. This is why you start with knight to f3 instead of pushing e5, because the knight 1 defends e5 an extra time, and it prevents this queen move. And the problem is now, after something like g3, because you don't want to move the king, you're going to lose castling rights. After g3, you can interpose. We eventually want to get the queen kind of in the center and punishing this rook, which is now exposed, but the knight guards this square. So there's a really nice intermezzo. Instead of responding to our queen being attacked, we take the knight with check. You have to recapture, and now queen to e4 is brutal. There's no time to worry about taking this knight. If you take it, we can just take back, and there's no way to save this rook. If you try and block with the knight, rook takes, the bishop is pinned, and white is in a lot of trouble here. So something like that was extremely helpful to me as someone coming in saying, this is a new opening I know very little about, and he, in breaking down this master game, says, well, here's something that I might have been worried about and why you shouldn't be. I think that's incredible, right? So finding people on YouTube who can, or chess coaches, people who are more familiar with these openings, who can talk to you about the do's and don'ts is something incredibly, incredibly helpful. Another example of this came from a different book, 1D4, the Chess Bible, by international master Armin Juhas. And he kind of, this is something that's kind of funny that I like to do. I don't know if other people do, but I would recommend it. Is if you're trying to learn an opening, is find people who have written books talking about how to beat it with the other color, right? So in the 1D4 Chess Bible, this is someone saying, if you're gonna play 1D4, here's your repertoire, here's what you should know. And so in this book, he talks about, well, what if your opponent plays the Benoni? I think he spends, again, more time on the modern Benoni than on the old one. But again, as long as we are only looking at those transposition lines, it's still going to apply to a lot of the games I play. So some of the stuff he writes about, right, because he's trying to tell someone with the white pieces how to defeat this, he's going to show multiple lines that black can play, and he's also going to show mistakes that both sides can make. And so this is really helpful for someone trying to learn a new opening. His explanation of the Old Benoni was, and this is what he wrote, Alekhine, among other players, played this move order. The advantage is it avoids some sidelines like the Trompowsky. And now I'm like, oh, that makes sense. So some people don't want to play knight f6 because now you have to worry about other stuff, right? They play, the Trompowsky is actually bishop to g5. If you didn't know that, you could always Google it. And now there's not really time to play c5 because they're just going to take your knight and life is strange. So that's maybe one advantage to this, is I can avoid a lot of those sidelines. But he writes the downside is that white can decide to play without c4. So this is again what kind of my coworker was telling me is, well, you can just play something like this and eventually get knight c3 without c4, and you can play for e4, and white has an incredibly strong center without having to commit to this c4 pawn and fall into a lot of the normal lines. So again, something to be aware of. He also commented on the space problem, right? That white is really invading our space and it's hard to keep everything safe. So that's another kind of noteworthy thing I found. Okay, I want to look at a couple of three more games. I think we'll have time for all three. Two of them are master games and one of them is one of my own. And again, the point of a master game isn't to say, well, here's all the moves you need to play, right? If you don't memorize these moves, you're no good. Maybe at a grandmaster, a super high level, you get to that point. But I think it's much more important to look at a master game and say, what are the plans? You know, not just what positions did these guys get to in what move orders, but what ideas were they trying to do, right? What were they making happen and how? Because that's what you can apply to your own game. You might not remember the move order, but you can remember a plan and think of different ways to execute it. So here was a game between Gurgenidze and Tal. Again, I said Mikhail Tal played this with the black pieces. This is a really nice example. It comes from 1957. In the game, we have d4, knight f6, c4, c5, d5, e6. Same transposition thing. This is the modern Benoni, but the old Benoni can get to these lines. Knight to c3, pawn takes d5, pawn takes d5, d6, knight to f3, g6. Again, we generally understand the basic ideas. d6 is played to defend this pawn, open up our bishop. We play this one to get this bishop into the game. Everything so far makes sense. e4, and this is, I think, still the main line. And now bishop to g7, but this was still in the 1d4 chess 5 book, and Juhas argues there that actually, you know, a6, a4, bishop g4 is a very nice idea for black. So is maybe recommending against this line of play for white, which is really helpful for me to know as a player with black that if my opponent plays this, here's what I should do. So really nice. And he argues here, this is so critical, right? Because remember we were looking earlier at, well, white doesn't want to trade this knight. He kind of confirms that idea for me. He says the problem here, the reason this is good for black, is because after trading away this knight, black can play knight from d7 to e5 more effectively, and no longer has to worry about this knight moving to c4, attacking my pawn, maybe attacking all of these dark squares generally. So again, giving me more confirmation and more information about what are the plans my opponent has, how do I fight against them, right? So this is super useful for me. Okay, back to our game. Bishop to g7, bishop to e2. Again, we know the idea here is now if bishop g4, the knight is fine to run away and can put pressure on my position. Black castles, white castles, rook to e8, you know, gaining more control of the e file. Knight back to d2. So even without being provoked by this bishop, already white still wants to do this plan. You know, so this is good to know. And knight to a6. And here Juhas commentates that this is a very thematic maneuver. Okay, so that tells me this is something I should pay attention to. This is something that comes up a lot in these types of games. And he explains, black wants to play knight to c7 to help carry out the thematic b5 plan. Okay, so that gives me a whole bunch of information. One, it shows me a way to deal with this problem, right? The knight can't really develop naturally and cleanly to c6, so it goes to a6, and then to c7, where it can help the pawn be defended on b5, which is also telling me we want to push this pawn to b5. That's not something I think I actually explicitly talked about so far, but it's really important to understand. As soon as we play c5, we're fighting for space on the queen side of the board. And so looking for ways, you know, a6 or this knight a6 to c7 maneuver, but once our knight's on c7, looking to push the pawn forward and fight on the queen side is a key plan in this opening. That's really important to know. So knight to a6. White plays rook to e1, knight goes to c7 as expected, a4, and we can understand this move now. It looks a little weird maybe at first, but now we say, well, black's plan is to play b5 one day, so white wants to put as much pressure against that move as possible. So this is something to look out for. It's a good move for white, and if they don't play it, then maybe we have the time to play b5. b6 is played, so kind of accepting, this is interesting, Tal is accepting here that a4 is effectively stopping our plan, at least for a while, and sometimes that's good to know too, right? When do we switch gears, and maybe this bishop's going to more calmly develop, Maybe it's going to be a slower push, but we're going to play a more positional game. We'll have to see. White plays queen to c2, defending e4, and knight to g4. And the commentator argues this is a more ambitious move that kind of stylistically something Tal would like to do, right? More aggressive, the knight's in the king's face. And he says that something just like rook to b8 with the simple plan of a6, b5 is still very reasonable. So that's also good for me to know. But knight to g4. And what's interesting is I didn't see the idea here. Now, Tal is always a fun one to watch. After h3, just trying to drive the knight away, Tal's whole point is now knight takes f2, sacrificing the knight kind of just out of the blue. And we start to realize, okay, white actually might be in trouble because look at the pressure that we can exert with our bishops. If our queen gets involved, it's actually kind of scary. You can't really afford not to take this knight because if you just like attack it, then I can still insist on sacrificing it, but now your king is just dead in the water. There's nothing around to keep you safe, so you can't really afford to do that. So in the game, king takes f2. And the point here isn't, again, necessarily to study tactics. You're welcome to. Master games are a great source for that. But this is more just understanding the opening plans. Queen to h4. The king went back to f1. If you tried to block with g3, there's just a lot of danger, right? We can invade with the bishop, and we're going to be taking here, defended by our bishop. It's just very, very scary. So in the game, king to f1. Bishop to d4, threatening checkmate. The knight drops back to d1, defending. And now queen takes h3, a really beautiful move. If you recapture, then the bishops dominate everything, and it's checkmate. So that's really nice. In the game instead, white saw this threat and played bishop to f3, but Tal was able to, use enough of this advantage to continue to press, and slowly but surely worked his way in, opening files, sacrificing material where he had to, but lining up his pieces to get them involved. And eventually the king is just too exposed and falls to Tal's sacrificial attack. This is a really beautiful plan. I think actually back in this position, white just resigns. If you had taken, then simply queen takes, and the king is just dead. And if instead you go here, then there's this really nice move, bishop to b3, because if the queen takes, again, we can just take and invade. And if the queen moves, then queen takes. This is a really nice line I found, and a beautiful opera checkmate. Again, the point of that isn't to, you're feel free to look at the game. It's a beautiful game, lots of nice tactics and attacking ideas to study. But what I'm interested in here is the opening, and I've learned a few key things. One, I learned that we have this really key idea. One, we would love to trade this knight for this bishop if possible, because we don't want it to come over here to c4 and annoy my pawns. Two, I've learned that I would really like to play b5 and fight on the queen side, and often to do that, I'm going to use my knight to a6 and then to c7, where it defends. And I'm also just going to play moves like a6 and rook to b8, and that's another plan. And finally, I saw that there's actually some nice attacking potential here, right? With the bishop kind of pointing at the castle, my control of the dark squares with this bishop really allowed Tal to do a lot of damage very quickly, which is nice to keep in mind in your own games as well. Okay, the next master game I want to take a look at is Shishkov versus Berelowitsch, something like that. I apologize for the mispronunciation. This was played more recently in 1999, and something similar, right? We're going to see what we can learn from this master game. d4, knight f6, c4, c5, d5, e6. Back to our modern Benoni position. And again, we see a lot of the same things happen. White wants to bring this knight out. The point of e6 is to take. The reason they're not pushing here is because it's too far advanced. Our bishop already attacks it. We can attack it with the queen. So you have to just accept that the pawn is going to get traded here. Takes, takes, d6. We don't want to let it push too far forward when we're not ready for it. So d6 to support everything. e4, g6, same thing again, h3. So this time, white is actively preventing the bishop from coming to g4. So this is going to be helpful to see, okay, well, what do we do in that case where this bishop is not really able to do that? Bishop to g7, knight f3, castles, bishop to d3. And this is actually helpful to me too, because remember, I said, well, why was this move not as popular? In the original reason, right, we said bishop e2 is better because the knight doesn't want to get traded. Well, here, white's already kind of avoided that with h3, so they can afford to move the bishop a little farther. So that's good to know too, right? You don't have to, double up on this idea. As long as the knight is free to jump around, then life is good for white. a6, preparing for the normal kind of b5 idea. a4, annoyingly stopping it. And now white goes to d7. Okay, so this knight, well, it's harder to play for b5, so maybe, and the bishop wasn't really doing anything, so black just decides that this knight that this bishop is okay to sit for a little while, and this knight now is maybe trying to control e5. Castles and knight to e8, and this is a really interesting move for me. Black wants to play knight to e5, and the point here is white wants to recapture with the bishop. So you don't want to play knight to e5 right away, because then if takes, the pawn takes, and notice that this pawn is actually in our own way, right? We control this space really well, but now our bishop is kind of sad, right? It's blocked off. So you don't really want to do that. So what black begins with knight to e8 so that you can play this move. White interrupts bishop g5. Now there's no time for knight to e5. We have to stop it. And f6 was the move of choice here. Just moving a knight back doesn't really seem to make sense with what our plan is. The bishop goes back to e3, but our structure is a little bit more damaged, and now the knight goes to e5. We've had to block this bishop anyway, so if we take, at least we can maybe take with this pawn. Knight takes, f takes. Queen goes to d2. This is a very common idea against these fianchettoed setups. To try and trade off the dark squared bishop, or the light squared, depending. Excuse me. And once it's gone, then it's easier. There's a lot of gaps in my king's safety, and it's easier for white to launch an attack. The knight goes back to f6. The trading has been done. Rook f to b1, which is saying maybe white wants to push this pawn at some point to fight against c5. There's already a lot of pressure here. Knight to h5, and king to h2. This is maybe a little bit trying to be preventative, maybe a little unnecessarily so. Knight to f4, jumping in. Bishop goes to f1 to add some defense to these squares the knight is eyeing up. And queen to h4, and I'm realizing, okay, this is another really interesting game where it looked like we wanted to fight on the queen side. And I think what's key here is sometimes it can be easy to lose sight of some of these things, is it's not that we should be attacking on the king side, but if white chooses to deny our queenside push with moves like a4 and knight c3 and this bishop, then what else can we do? Well, we have some ideas of maybe putting some attacking pressure, right? Our bishop here is really annoying. The knight moving in, we can maybe switch up to a kingside attack. This is another good thing to know. The game continued f3, and really beautiful, knight takes h3, because now after the pawn takes, rook takes f3, and everything is invading. It is very hard to defend. The queen went to e1, trying to force a trade, but rook takes h3, sacrificing the rook for an invasion. Black now has two threats. Bishop to f3, threatening a lot of different checkmating ideas, and rook to f8, just sliding over to cut off the king and add checks. And even though we've sacked some material, it's very hard to stop. The game continued, knight to d1, bishop to f3, threatening checkmate and some other checks. The queen goes to d2, defending, rook to f8, and white resigned here, but just one sample line of how the attack could continue was if white tries to defend with queen to h2, then check, king to f1, takes the knight with check. Now black is just up material and the king is still on the run. Queen takes e4. If you take my bishop, I will take yours. Rook takes, queen takes. Queen blocks on e2. We wouldn't mind a trade here because we're ahead, but there's other ways to win. Queen to g3 and pinning the queen to the king. And we could go on from here, but this seems sufficient. What are the things we've learned from this game? Well, I learned mainly that in these types of positions, one thing we can choose to do is, if we can't fight on the queen side with our normal push, is to potentially fight for e5, and to do so in a way that we can take back the way we want, right? We would love our bishop to recapture and keep all those lines open rather than taking with a pawn and blocking it off. Because even though there was a beautiful attack in the end of this game, notice that this bishop didn't really have anything to do with all of it. It was fully blocked off. So if that can be avoided, that's ideal. Okay. Now I want to end with my final recommendation, right? You've looked at some videos, you've talked to some friends, you've read some books, you've done some research. Well, that's great, but ultimately the whole point of this is to learn a new opening so you can play it. So what I did, and what I recommend, and this actually works a lot better if you're doing a few different openings, is to play some games online or in person, but especially online, and play at time control that's faster than what you're used to. So play, like if you're used to playing 15-minute games, maybe drop it down to 10 or even 5 minutes. What's the reason for that? Normally, I advise my students to play longer games because I want them to work on, thinking and spending time and really understanding the positions. But when you're trying to study an opening, if you have to blitz out your moves much faster than you're used to, it forces you to test whether or not you actually know the ideas and kind of are feeling the sense of the opening, or if you don't really get it at all and you need to go back and do some more research. The problem is if you've done what I did, which is just have one opening you want to study, then you're going to have a lot of games you play that your opponent does not help you out. So I played about a dozen games on I think chess.com, or maybe 2 dozen, where half the time I was white and so I just have to play something else. And then most of the time when I'm black, my opponent plays pawn to e4. Because again, I'm playing faster times and that's what happens most of the time. So I very rarely got what I wanted to try. But after about 2 dozen games, I had an opponent very kindly help me out in a very strange way. Every move I was blitzing out c5 because this was the whole point of the lecture. And my opponent starts with knight to f3, and I'm so sad. But then they play d4, so maybe I have a chance. I go knight to f6, they push past, e6, c4, we're back in book. This is back to the game. Now knight f3 is maybe a little strange. They might sometimes wait for that a little more, but I'm back to like this opening. This is what I've been studying. And so now I'm excited and I'm thinking, okay, let's remember, so I want to take this pawn, so I took, they took back. d6, right? We don't want to let them push too far when we're not ready for it at a bad time, and we want to keep our pawn on c5 safe. Knight to c3, and from here I'm like, okay, wait, what do I do? What do I do? Oh, I should fianchetto, right? I want to control these dark squares. So far I feel like I'm doing well. e4, and now we're actually like fully back in book, right? This is like just a real chess position. Bishop to g7, bishop to g5. This is still theoretical. Again, a lot of the people here played something like bishop e2 because they didn't want the knight to get traded. And I castled. The move the computer really likes here, and some of the masters, is to play h6, kicking this bishop. So something like h6, and the bishop drops back, and you can kind of just chase it down and attack it. This is something I kind of saw. And the idea is we're removing this piece from control of the dark squares, and our bishop is getting so much better because it's got something, this thing can't fight against us. So that's kind of one of the ideas I learned in retrospect. I just castled. Bishop e2 now. And again, if I play bishop g4 here, white has this idea of switching sides, so maybe another opportunity to play that. And I played knight b to d7. And this is the first move that I really went off track. I went way off the database, right? Because remember, what are the opening ideas here? Well, I probably should, maybe I can play for a6 and b5. Maybe I can still bring the bishop out to g4 and see if my opponent doesn't know this idea. Because if I can trade for this knight, that's still really helpful. The problem with this move is I was kind of combining some of the games in my memory. I was thinking, well, wait a minute, wasn't there that game where he went to e5? Well, the problem is he did that only after he had to. Probably first, I ought to go for this idea. And if my opponent shuts me down with a4, then I say, okay, no need to worry. Maybe even better, I start with knight to a6. Because if I play pawn to a6, I notice I've kind of move ordered myself into a tricky situation where now my knight can't actually defend this square, right? It can't go to a6 anymore. If I start with the knight and bounce it over, then I can play a6 after and I have more defenders on this square. But so maybe that's something I can work on with this opening. But I went knight to d7. Here, castles was played, and now I played a6, so I'm still going for that idea. But after a4, it's kind of tough to go for this, right? I can't do it right away because of the same thing we saw at the very beginning. There's this weird pin situation between these rooks. And if takes, then I can't actually take back, or I'm going to lose my rook. It's also just, even if I was, it's just not defended enough, right? It's attacked 3 times and only defended the once. So maybe I should have moved with the knight first, but even still, maybe this just wasn't the right idea. I played rook to b8. I think I'm still being thematic with the plans. The computer doesn't love this move because it's maybe a little too slow. I still probably should be fighting against this bishop and trying to improve my own. But I'm still, I think, working on following the basic ideas. Here, white plays a serious blunder, b3. To me, this looks like a normal move at first glance. I'm just maybe stopping me from ever pushing forward. But the problem is, again, notice these dark squares are all so weak now. My bishop is just a monster. This is something that I totally missed while I was playing this, because again, it was a faster time control and my first time really playing a game with this opening. But that's something really good to know is, oh, I should really be paying attention to the squares, right? These pawns are all focused on light squares, and now this bishop is just seeing everything. And I got a little stubborn here, because I was like, okay, well, I've defended this b5 push a little. I wish my knight had gone to a6 first, because then it would be easier. But I need an extra defender on this square. And so I thought, well, let's do the queen. This is something I do all the time, right? The c-pawn is moved. Let's get the queen in the game. The problem is the same as with the rook, right? Now, as soon as I push and white takes, my queen gets hit by the rook. So this is, some opening inexperience. And again, I learned a lot of this through, not while I was playing it. Some of it I did, but a lot as well through analysis after the fact. I went over the game and looked at the computer and looked at the databases and said, what am I doing well, what am I not? The problem here is, I just can't really, even though I'm defending it, I can't push this pawn. Queen to c2, defending the knight. And I realized, okay, this was a misplay. My queen doesn't actually belong here. I should pull it back. And so I went back to c7. It's, sometimes, a bit humiliating to play a move and then immediately retreat, but it's important to recognize when you've made a mistake and not just let it sit there and get in your own way. So I'm back to c7. Opponent played bishop to f4, recognizing the pin is no longer working. I think the bishop was fine there, but this is still a nice diagonal to fight for and to fight against this pawn, right? Remember, white really wants to do this idea of putting pressure on d6, so this seems a good way to do it. And I played knight to e5. And again, the problem here, well, I was too early, right? I should let the bishop be defending this knight, not the pawn, because I don't want to cut it off. White should just trade here, whether with the knight or the bishop, I'm not sure, and let me force a pawn in my own way. Instead, white doesn't recognize that and just retreats the bishop, and I can move this knight out of the way and kind of defend everything. And now after takes, I'm actually doing fine. f4, I drop my knight back to d7, but we see a lot of the same kind of similar attacking ideas, even if they're not executed as well from either side. Knight to d1, just kind of rerouting the knight. We'll talk about that in a second. b5, the knight is not defending the square, so I push forward. Pawn takes, e5, striking forward in the center. I took, opponent takes, bishop takes, queen takes. Lots of trades. Queen goes to c3, offering me a free bishop. I decline because we're playing a bullet game and I have maybe 10 seconds and I don't see it. But we reach this position. I play knight f6, again, very low on time, just losing a pawn. And after this position is reached, I run out of time. White has 25 seconds left on the clock. But the point wasn't to win this game. Remember, the reason I'm playing a fast time control is so I can get experience with this opening. And I think I did. I learned a whole bunch from losing this game. I learned a few things. I learned that this plan of A6 and B5, Rook B8 can be a little slow. I need to be aware of how much A4 stops this plan. I learned about the move order. Maybe I should have put the knight here first so it's not kind of clogging everything up. I was reminded of how I shouldn't just move my queen out on this diagonal because it's an option, because it's now in my own way, right? This rook is going to attack it. I learned not to put my knight just in the center because it's going to get traded away and my pawn is going to block my beautiful bishop, which later on, some of you might have caught this, but I didn't, was after knight to d1, my beautiful, beautiful bishop is just ready to take that rook. And the reason I found this was because the computer said, you're playing a fine game, and then this move, blunder, 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 because there was a rook that could have been taken or saved. So, that happens. But the point is, playing this game really taught me a lot about the opening that I wouldn't have gotten just from reading, right? The information, the resources, the videos helped me get the basics of it, but then I had to figure out, how do I apply this? And I'm only going to know what did I learn and what did I miss when I play it and test it out. So that's my recommendation to you. Find some of those really good resources, learn the basic plans and goals of the opening, look at some master games, look at videos and have people explain the ideas to you, and then just play some games and give it a shot. It can take a little bit of time and practice, and you might not do it quite as well as me if you're not as strong a player just naturally or don't have as much experience, and that's okay. Don't try and compare. Just pick an opening you think sounds fun and see what you can do with it. That is all the time we have tonight, but thank you for sticking with me for Beginner Breakdown. I hope this has been helpful, and please stick around as our Grandmaster in Residence, Viktor Mikhailovsky, will be teaching right after this. So thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.